And we're back with my latest guest, Stephen King. Now, Steve, you've written countless horror novels and short stories in your very long and prolific career. But does anything actually scare you? I guess what I'm really asking here is, what is Stephen King truly afraid of? You know, Conan, the only real fear I have is that one day in the distant future, I will be forgotten. My books will have been surpassed by many great authors, and no one will feel the need to read my books again. Oh, I don't think you have to worry about that, Steve. I mean, you can't really go anywhere on BookTube without some random guy in his 20s talking about your books. Well, that's flattering for you to say. I mean, take Bookish Drummer, for example. What did you say? You know, Jake from the Bookish Drummer. He's got such a great BookTube channel. I mean, his opinions are hot garbage. Why do you say that, Steve? Have you seen his ranking videos? They're horrible. I mean, come on. Oh, I don't know about that, Steve. I think he has really good insights on your books. And I mean, at least he's honest. He's a hack. He's not a true constant reader. Well, Steve, it just so happens that we have him here tonight. What? Ladies and gentlemen, Jake, the Bookish Drummer. God damn it. Glad to be here, Conan. Longtime fan of the show.
Jake, you're a gentleman and you're a very funny guy. And you're also very, very good at what you do. And I like calling you a friend. Makes me feel good.
This is ridiculous. Is there anything you want to say to your favorite author, Jake? Well, actually, Conan, he's only my second favorite author. You son of a bitch. I know Stephen King says his biggest fear is being forgotten, but I know his true fear, his true phobia. Oh, really? I'm not afraid of anything. I'm the master of terror. Is that so? Then you won't have a problem with me showing this Cam Newton lawn gnome? Jesus! What up? I gotta get out of here. That is one hyper-specific phobia. Anyway, while I still have you here, Jake, what is your next video gonna be about? Well, Conan, I'll tell you. Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I'm going to talk about what I believe to be Stephen King's 10 scariest books. Now, as sort of a caveat for this video, I don't normally get scared by books. I don't really get scared in general. Like, I grew up watching horror movies and scary movies as a kid, like from a very young age. Like, I was in elementary school watching, Friday the 13th, Halloween, and of course, random Stephen King horror movies. So from a very young and early age, I was very quickly desensitized by many different just horror tropes and just, I just don't get scared very easily. But if I had to make a top 10 Stephen King scariest books, these are the books that I would include. And probably like the top 3 are the books that I actually do find pretty creepy and pretty scary, even for me. I figured right in the middle of October during spooky season, right before Halloween, would be a great time to film and upload this video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So before I get to the top 10, I'm going to quickly mention some honorable mentions. And the first one I'll mention is Skeleton Crew, which is his second published short story collection. It's very popular, not necessarily one of my favorites, but it does have a handful of short stories in here that are damn creepy. Like The Mist, The Jaunt, Survivor Type, and what's the other one? The Raft. Overall, this isn't one of my standout favorites from King, but it does have a handful of short stories that are indeed very creepy. And then I'm going to mention 2 probably standout favorites among King fans just right off the back that are not in my top 10. I'm going to put The Shining and The Stand. So let me explain why they're not quite in my top 10. The Shining, I grew up watching the movie and I always thought the movie was very creepy, even for me as someone who doesn't get scared very easily. So reading the book, it is different obviously, but I basically knew what was going to happen. I wasn't really too freaked out by anything. And then The Stand I will include here just because part 1 is actually terrifying, but everything else after that is just a boring, tedious mess for me. So I didn't feel like I could include it in the top 10, but yeah, definitely part 1 is very creepy. And then the last book for my honorable mention is going to be The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. Now, recently I was talking to my good friend Sharon Dwyer about this book. This was the very first Stephen King book I ever read, but I read it in middle school and it just didn't hit me quite as much because I was a kid back then. So reading about a kid getting lost in the woods when you're that young isn't necessarily scary. But Sharon, as a mom, reading about, a little girl getting lost in the woods, she was terrified. And I kind of want to go back and reread it kind of in that mind frame. And I think if I do, I will find it very creepy and terrifying. And I forgot to mention that this is a top 10 list, but books 10 through 4 aren't necessarily in any kind of order. It's mainly just the top 3 that I think are the actual scariest. But for the rest of these books, they're creepy, but I'm not going to put them in any kind of order. So the first book I'll mention on this list is one that pertains to me and my channel, which is Night Shift, which is his very first short story collection. And the reason I'm going to bring this up is shameless plug. I am starting a Stephen King short story book club over on the Bookish Drummer Discord. We're going to start this on November 1st, and we're going to read 1 short story a week, sometimes 2 if they're short enough. But I'm going to open up different channels for all of the short stories. There's 20 short stories in here. I'm going to open up channels for all of the short stories so we can go on there and chat about all of them. And I hope you guys will come join me on the Bookish Drummer Discord for the Stephen King short story book club. All right, shameless plug is over for now. But basically, yeah, this is on the list because it's his most terrifying short story collection. And what I mean by that is that this is his first short story collection, and all of these stories are horror, or at least horror adjacent. Whereas some of his later short story collections, he delves more into literary and different genres, whereas this one, it's mainly just here to terrify you. And there's a couple of standout, or not a couple, there's a lot of standout stories that are pretty terrifying. Like Graveyard Shift, I Am the Doorway, The Mangler, Gray Matter, Quitters Inc., which is, spoiler alert, that's probably my favorite. Children of the Corn, there's just lots of classic horror in this collection, and I am very excited to read it on November 1st. Shameless plug. And look at that cover. You know this is going to be a creepy ass book with a cover like this. And actually sometimes you get book covers that have nothing to do with the actual what's in the book. This pertains to a story that's in there, so be on the lookout. The next one I'll talk about is a Richard Bachman book, one of my favorites, The Long Walk. The book itself is pretty creepy, but overall just the general premise of gathering basically like 100 kids and making them, go on this dystopian walk where if they stop, a certain amount of times, they're shot on sight. And basically you're going to be left with one kid and they get a prize of essentially whatever they want. It's a very disturbing thought experiment. And it was definitely an influence for stuff that would come afterwards, like The Hunger Games, and then even now, like Squid Game, right? Everyone's watching that. This was, ahead of its time, really. And just reading the book, and you get further along and further along, and you just see all of these kids just dying, just one by one, and it's pretty horrifying, really. And I'll go ahead and mention this next book, even though for me personally, I don't find it very scary, even though a lot of people think it's his scariest book. For me, I'm more interested in the character work than actually like the scares of it. And of course, I'm talking about It. Don't get me wrong, this is definitely a creepy novel, But for me, I'm more interested in what Stephen King can do with his characters, and definitely his best attribute is getting the reader to care about the characters. So when scary and spooky stuff starts happening to them, you feel like they're actually in danger, and that's what he's good at. But for me, the idea of like a scary clown who's able to kind of like shapeshift into like these random things, like that is pretty creepy. But for me, the things that he turns into to scare the children, like, aren't that scary to me. Like, there's like, for one of the kids, he turns into a mummy, and then another, he turns into like a werewolf. It's not that scary to me, to be honest. And like I said, I'm pretty jaded at this point, so reading this, as an adult, just wasn't that creepy. But I can definitely see, like, if you're like a preteen, like reading this book for the first time, you're probably going to be freaked out. This next novel, I wouldn't necessarily say it's scary, but it's hands down one of the most disturbing books that King has ever written. He even thought about not publishing it at one point. He thought people would not want to read it. But thankfully he did. And we got Pet Sematary. If you've read the book, you know why this book is so disturbing for a lot of people, including myself. It's, like I said, it's not necessarily scary. It's just a really disturbing thought experiment to where, like, what kind of lengths would I go to save someone, that I really love? And it's heartbreaking. And it's just, the King really delves into like grief, and it's at times it can be emotionally draining. And again, not necessarily scary, but definitely disturbing. So for this next book, it's actually not one of his novels. It's one of his newer novella collections entitled Full Dark, No Stars. And the title is, of course, very fitting. Full Dark, No Stars. 4 novellas that are just very dark in nature. Honestly, he could have published this as a Richard Bachman collection, and it wouldn't have been that much of a leap. I mean, the stories that he writes in here deal with the murder of family members, a rape revenge tale, and like finding out that your spouse is actually a serial killer. Like, it's very dark and scary subject matters here. So yeah, hands down, this had to be on the list for me. One of the stories in here is actually more of a short story, and it's kind of more, I guess, on the satirical or like dark comedy side of things. But definitely the 3 novellas that you get in here: 1922, Big Driver, and Good Marriage. They're very scary novellas. This next book is also one of the newer books on the list. This is a book that he wrote, I think, in like 2015. I'm not very good with dates, y'all, but it was in the past decade or so. It's one of his newer releases, and that would be Revival. Now, the reason this book is on the list isn't necessarily that the book overall is very scary, because really you're just kind of delving into this guy, and you start out, he's a little kid, and you see how his life progresses, and you just see the directions that his life goes in. And with the themes of the novel, he delves really into death and religion and the afterlife. And the very ending of the book is why this book is on the list. The ending is just so nihilistic and so dark, and just one of the most creepy ass endings of a Stephen King book that I've ever read. It's definitely an ending that once you read it, you're never gonna forget it, and you're like, what the hell just happened? And for that reason, this definitely deserves to be on the list. This next book should come as no surprise. I'm sure it would be on pretty much everyone's top 10 scariest Stephen King books list. And that would, of course, be Salem's Lot, his second published novel, his vampire novel. This isn't necessarily one of my all-time favorite Stephen King novels. And like I said, it's his second published novel. And for me, while it is scary and it's very creepy, and the horror elements are definitely there, he definitely focuses on that, his character work isn't as good as some of his later novels that I come to love. But, you know, it's still classic Stephen King, and he's dealing with vampires in like a small Maine town, and it's a classic for a reason. There's definitely some horrifying scenes in here, and I've read this book twice now, and even knowing like what's going to come next, it's still very creepy. So yes, very deserving to be on this list, but not quite in my top 3 scariest Stephen King novels. So before I get to my top 3, I think this will be a fun experiment. Pause the video and in the comments, list what you think my scariest Stephen King novels are. There's 3 of them, and I will be very interested to see if you guys can guess what they are. All right, quick intermission. Pennywise, what do you think about Bookish Drummer not thinking that it is scary?
I think it's a load of horse shit. How could you possibly read that book and not be scared shitless?
And what do you have to say about the rumor that you're dating George R.R. Martin?
Those rumors are completely unfounded. You have no proof.
Oh, Penny Boop!
God damn it, George, get out of here.
Penny Boop. So for my 3 scariest Stephen King novels, they all have something very much in common. And I want to give a quick shout out to Harry from the BookTube channel Other Worlds Than These. He pointed out the clear difference between his realistic horror and his more supernatural horror. And for me, the realistic horror is definitely creepier and scarier, for me personally. And he basically pointed out the 3 books that I'm going to talk about in this video. They're my 3 scariest horror novels that King has ever written. And they're definitely clear examples of like how realistic King can portray his horror. And for me, that's terrifying. And these are all like situationally based, where if I was put in these situations, it would be terrifying. Well, I mean, it would be terrifying for anyone really. And these are basically all situational. Like if you were in this situation that the characters were in, it would be horrifying. The first one that I'll go ahead and talk about is Cujo. Now, for me, this book is pretty terrifying. And I've recently talked about this book, and not a lot of people rate it highly. Like, if you go on Goodreads and look at the rating, it's fairly low for Stephen King. And, you know, that's kind of understandable because it's a book that doesn't have any chapters, and the first half of it is more on the literary side, where you're basically just going through, like, these people's lives. The real horror elements don't get introduced till halfway through the book. But for me, when that starts happening, it's just putting myself in the situation that the characters are in. Horrifying. Basically, you've got a mom and a young boy who are locked in a car in the sweltering summer heat, and it's broken down, and they can't get out to go for help because Cujo, the rabid Saint Bernard, is out there lurking around. And, you know, it's like, you know, you're stuck in a car, it's in the middle of the summer, the heat is blaring, you have no AC, you have no food, you have no water, and all you want to do is leave that car to go, you know, get your son some help because he's basically dying of dehydration. And you can't because this dog is out loose with rabies, and he is just, it's so scary. It's just like, what would you do in that situation? And I think King does a very good job with it. It's very terrifying. Another situation that I don't want to find myself in, hopefully not, you never know, but it would be Gerald's Game. And it basically starts out with this older couple, middle-aged couple, who are going away on vacation, and they're trying to kind of, you know, spice up their love life. And they have this game that Gerald likes to play, Gerald's Game, where the woman gets handcuffed to the bed and, you know, they have sex. And it starts out where she gets handcuffed, but she really is not into it, and she kind of wants the husband to stop, and the husband is acting like he, you know, wants to go through with it, but then all of a sudden he drops dead of a heart attack, and he's dead on the floor. And she's handcuffed to a bed, and she can't do anything about it. She is stuck there. And just that thought alone is just terrifying. Like, you literally can't get out of bed. You are handcuffed to a bed, and your spouse is just dead on the floor, and you have no way of escaping. And you're in the middle of like a summer like cabin, and there's no one around for miles. And like, there's no way you can get a phone. There's no way you can call out for help. And what do you do? And that's basically what King delves into in this short novel. And I think it's brilliant. Again, very low ratings on Goodreads. I don't get it, but it's very scary, very terrifying thought experiment. Like, what would you do if you were in the situation? And I think it's very scary. And then, of course, if you haven't guessed already, the scariest book, not even Stephen King, the scariest book I have ever read is Misery. And Misery is one of my all-time favorite books, one of my all-time favorite horror books. It's my second favorite King novel, just behind The Dead Zone, which is not a horror novel. And of course, like I said, with Cujo and Gerald's Game, they're both situationally scary. And the situation that Paul Sheldon finds himself in is horrifying. He's an author who has been writing this series, the Misery series, with this character named Misery, and he's doesn't really like it, and he just wants it to end so he can work on more literary stuff and what he wants to focus on. So he writes the last Misery book. But on his way back home, he gets into a horrible accident, and who, of course, saves him but his number one fan, Annie Wilkes. And, of course, Paul Sheldon realizes that his legs are essentially useless. They're completely broken. He can't walk. He's stuck in bed, on all kinds of pain medications. And, and Annie Wilkes, you slowly realize that she's pretty crazy. And even if he did want to escape, like, he's in the middle of Colorado, like in the middle of nowhere, essentially. And it's, snowy, and there's like blizzards, and like, it's a really bad situation. Not only that, but she's, like I said, she's crazy, and she's his number one fan. She loves the Misery novels. And what do you know? He has, she's reading his new manuscript for the Misery novel, the last Misery novel. But she doesn't know it's the last Misery novel. So when she reads it, bad things happen, and shit gets out of control, and it's just, putting myself in Paul Sheldon's place is just horrifying. And I remember the first time I read it, I had already seen the movie, but for me, the book is scarier. And I love Kathy Bates' performance. She did a fantastic job, one of my all-time favorite movies, but the book is just so utterly terrifying. And yep, that's the scariest, not only the scariest Stephen King novel I've read, but hands down the scariest book I've ever read. There you go. So, what did you guys think of this video? Do you agree with any of my picks here? Did I not include any scary books that you would have included here? Also, I'll be interested to see in the comments if you guys were able to predict what my scariest Stephen King novels were. I think that'll be a lot of fun to go through. And of course, leave down in the comments also, what are your scariest Stephen King novels? What Stephen King novel did you read that just made you stay up late at night and gave you nightmares? And also, as I mentioned before, another shameless plug, Night Shift, Stephen King Short Story Book Club. Go check it out on the Bookish Drummer Discord. We're going to be starting this November 1st. And like I said, about one short story a week, sometimes two if they're short enough. It's a very chill book club. You don't have to necessarily read every Stephen King short story here. You can kind of pick and choose, or if you're busy, you can catch up later. Very chill, very little commitment here. I think it's just going to be a lot of fun to tackle all these short stories. And of course, this is the perfect one to start with because they're very scary and creepy and terrifying and good. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and my Bookish Drummer Discord. Anyway, Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.